The blood on Fletcher Dawson's hands had been dry for 2 years, but he still saw it every time he closed his eyes, still felt the weight of his brother's last breath against his chest, still heard the shot that had silenced his own voice forever. He worked the cattle ranch outside Alta, Utah, in the summer of 1878, keeping his head down and his mouth shut, communicating only through nods and gestures, never uttering a single word to anyone who tried to speak with him. Until the evening Teresa Graham arrived at the ranch looking for work with her worn, traveling bag and eyes that held their own kind of silence. She stood in the dusty yard as the sun dipped low behind the Wasatch Mountains, her brown hair pulled back in a simple braid, her dress patched but clean, her chin lifted with a pride that seemed at odds with the desperation Fletcher could read in the lines around her mouth. Old man Patterson, who owned the spread, looked her up and down with skepticism written across his weathered face. "We need ranch hands, girl, not house help," Patterson said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "I can work cattle," Teresa said, her voice steady and clear. "I grew up on my father's ranch in Colorado before he lost it to the bank. I can rope, brand, mend fence, break horses if you need it. I will work harder than any man you have got, and I will take half the pay just to prove it." Patterson scratched his beard, considering. Fletcher stood near the barn, watching the exchange without expression, his hat pulled low over his dark eyes. He had seen plenty of people come and go from this place, but something about the way this woman stood her ground made him pause in his work. "Half pay for a month," Patterson finally said. "You prove yourself, maybe we talk about fair wages. You bunk in the small cabin behind the main house. Meals with the hands. You cause any trouble, you are gone." "Understood, understood," Teresa said, and Fletcher saw her shoulders relax just slightly, saw the relief she tried to hide. Patterson gestured toward Fletcher. "Dawson here will show you around. He does not talk, but he knows this place better than anyone. You follow his lead, you will learn what you need to know." Teresa turned to look at Fletcher fully for the first time, and their eyes met across the yard. He saw intelligence there, and wariness, and something else he could not quite name. He gave a short nod and turned toward the barn, not waiting to see if she would follow. He heard her footsteps behind him, quick and light despite the heavy bag she carried. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay and horse and leather. Fletcher pointed to the tack room, then to the stalls, then to the feed storage, moving through the space with practiced efficiency. Teresa watched everything carefully, asking no questions, seeming to understand that words would be wasted on him. When he showed her the small cabin where she would stay, barely more than 4 walls and a roof with a narrow bed and a washstand, she set down her bag and turned to him. "Thank you," she said simply. Fletcher nodded once and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "They told me in town that you have not spoken in 2 years," she said. "I just want you to know that I understand. Sometimes silence is the only thing that makes sense." He looked back at her, searching her face for pity or curiosity, but found neither. He nodded again, slower this time, and left her to settle in. The work began before dawn the next morning. Fletcher was already in the barn saddling horses when Teresa appeared, her hair still in the same braid, her dress exchanged for men's trousers and a work shirt that had seen better days. She moved to the next stall without being told and began saddling her own mount with capable hands. Fletcher watched from the corner of his eye, noting the way she checked the cinch twice, the way she gentled the horse with soft touches before putting on the bridle. She knew what she was doing. They rode out with 3 other ranch hands to move cattle from the high pasture down closer to the ranch. The morning air was crisp and clean, the sky so blue it hurt to look at, the mountains rising like sentinels around them. Fletcher led the way along the narrow trail, his body moving with the rhythm of his horse, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Teresa rode behind him, sitting her saddle like she had been born to it, and he found himself grudgingly impressed. The other hands, Tom and Jack and young Billy, who could not have been more than 19, kept their distance from Teresa at first, exchanging glances and muttering comments Fletcher could not hear. He knew the kind of things they were likely saying. He had heard it all before about women who dared to do men's work. He paid them no mind and focused on the task at hand. The cattle were scattered across the high meadow, grazing peacefully in the morning sun. Fletcher raised his hand to signal the others to spread out, and they began the slow process of gathering the herd and pushing them downhill. Teresa took her position on the left flank without hesitation, working in concert with the others as if she had been doing this with them for years rather than hours. When a young steer broke from the group and tried to bolt up the mountain, she wheeled her horse around and cut it off with expert timing, bringing it back to the herd with calm efficiency. By the time they got the cattle down to the lower pasture, and the sun was high overhead, even Tom and Jack were watching her with something like respect. They broke for a quick meal of jerky and hardtack, sitting in the shade of a rocky outcropping while the horses rested. "You are not lying about knowing cattle," Tom said to Teresa, his tone friendlier than it had been that morning. "My father taught me everything," Teresa said, taking a long drink from her canteen. "Before the drought came and took it all." "That is rough," Billy said, his young face sympathetic. "Lot of that going around. My uncle lost his place last year." "It is the way of things," Teresa said with a shrug that tried to be careless but did not quite succeed. "You adapt or you die." Fletcher listened to the conversation without contributing, chewing his jerky slowly and staring out at the mountains. He felt Teresa's eyes on him but did not turn to meet them. He had learned that the less attention he drew to himself, the easier life became. People eventually stopped trying to make him talk, stopped asking questions about what had happened, stopped looking at him with that mixture of pity and fascination that made his skin crawl. The afternoon brought more work, mending a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree, checking the water sources to make sure they were flowing properly, moving supplies from the main barn to one of the line shacks farther up the mountain. Teresa worked alongside them without complaint, her movements efficient and economical, never wasting energy but never shirking either. By the time they rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, Fletcher could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, but she sat her horse straight and tall, refusing to show weakness. Patterson was waiting in the yard when they returned. "How did she do?" he asked Tom. "Better than some men I have worked with," Tom admitted, dismounting and loosening his cinch. "She knows her business." Patterson grunted, which might have been approval. "Dawson," Fletcher met the old man's eyes and nodded once firmly. "Good enough," Patterson said. "Graham, you keep this up. We will talk about proper wages end of the month." "Thank you, sir," Teresa said, and Fletcher heard the genuine gratitude in her voice. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Up before dawn, working until the light failed, collapsing into bed too tired to dream. Fletcher and Teresa often worked together, their silence creating an odd kind of companionship. She never pushed him to talk, never acted like his muteness was strange or pitiable. She simply worked beside him, occasionally commenting on the weather or the cattle or some small thing she had noticed, not seeming to mind that he never responded verbally. He would nod or shake his head, point or gesture, and somehow she always understood. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, they were sent together to one of the high-line shacks to check on a small herd that had been moved up for summer grazing. It was a 2-day trip, up through pine forests and across mountain meadows where wildflowers bloomed in riotous colors. They packed supplies and bedrolls, bringing along 2 extra horses to carry everything they would need. The ride up was peaceful, the only sounds the creak of leather and the soft plodding of hooves on the mountain trail. Fletcher found himself more aware of Teresa's presence than he wanted to be, noticing the way she tilted her face up to catch the sun, the way she smiled at a deer that bounded across the path ahead of them, the way her hands rested easy on the reins. There was something steady about her, something that did not demand anything from him, and he realized with a start that he had not felt this comfortable around another person since his brother died. They reached the line shack in late afternoon, a small log cabin tucked into a grove of aspens with a stream running nearby. The cattle were scattered across the surrounding meadows, looking healthy and fat on the summer grass. Fletcher and Teresa unsaddled the horses and turned them into the small corral, then set about making the cabin habitable for the night. It was dusty from disuse, but sound, with a stone fireplace and 2 narrow bunks built into the walls. "I will get water," Teresa said, grabbing the bucket. "You want to start a fire?" Fletcher nodded and watched her walk down to the stream, her stride confident and loose. He gathered kindling from the woodpile outside and got a fire going in the fireplace, then unpacked their supplies. By the time Teresa returned with fresh water, he had coffee brewing and salt pork heating in a pan. They ate in comfortable silence as the light faded outside and the fire crackled between them. Fletcher sat on one of the bunks, Teresa on the other, both of them tired but content. The mountains were peaceful at this elevation, the air thin and clean, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky visible through the open door. "This is the part I missed most," Teresa said quietly, staring into the fire. "When we lost the ranch and I had to move to Denver, I thought I would die in that city. Too many people, too much noise, everything crowded and dirty and wrong. Out here you can breathe. Out here, things make sense." Fletcher understood exactly what she meant. After his brother's death, he had tried to stay in the town where they had grown up, tried to continue living the life they had planned together. But everywhere he looked, there were memories. Every person who spoke to him wanted to know what happened, wanted the story, wanted to offer useless condolences that only made the wound deeper. He had left in the middle of the night with nothing but his horse and his saddle and had ridden until he found this place, this ranch where he could lose himself in work and silence. "I suppose you have your own reasons for being here," Teresa continued, still gazing into the flames. "For choosing silence. I will not ask you about them. We have all got our ghosts." She looked up at him then, and in the firelight her eyes were very dark and very sad. Fletcher felt something shift in his chest, some small crack in the wall he had built around himself. He wanted to tell her, wanted to explain about his brother, about the ambush that had killed him, about the guilt that had stolen Fletcher's voice. But the words were locked away too deep, buried under 2 years of silence, and he could not reach them. Instead, he stood and went to his saddlebag, pulling out something he had not looked at in months. It was a small tintype photograph, the edges worn from handling, showing 2 young men standing side by side. They looked nearly identical, same dark hair, same strong jaw, same eyes. Brothers. Fletcher held it out to Teresa. She took it carefully, studying the image in the firelight. "Twins?" she asked softly. Fletcher nodded. "What was his name?" Fletcher pulled out a small piece of paper and the stub of a pencil, writing in careful block letters, "Frank." "Frank and Fletcher," Teresa said, handing back the photograph. "That is a good name. Was he older or younger?" Fletcher held up 2 fingers, then pointed to himself. 2 minutes. You were older by 2 minutes." He nodded, tucking the photograph back into his saddlebag with hands that shook slightly. "I am sorry," Teresa said, and the simple sincerity in her voice made his throat tighten. "I lost my mother when I was 16. It is not the same, I know, but I understand that kind of grief. The kind that changes everything." Fletcher sat back down on his bunk, looking at her across the fire. He wanted to ask about her mother, about her father, about what had brought her alone to Alta looking for ranch work. But asking required words, and words required vulnerability, and vulnerability was something he could not afford. As if reading his thoughts, Teresa smiled slightly. "My mother died of fever. My father tried to hold things together, but the drought came and we lost most of the cattle, and then the bank came calling. He sold everything to pay what debts he could, then took what was left and headed to California. He wanted me to go with him, but I could not. California felt like giving up, like admitting that the life we built meant nothing. So I went to Denver instead, worked as a seamstress for 2 years, saving every penny. I thought maybe I could earn enough to buy back the ranch or start a new one. But Denver just made me realize that I was not made for that kind of life. I was not made for cities and sewing and sitting still. So I took what money I had and came looking for work on a ranch, any ranch, and here I am." She laughed, a sound without much humor. "My father probably thinks I am crazy. Maybe I am. But at least I am crazy out here under these stars instead of crazy in some city apartment." Fletcher found himself nodding in understanding. There was something about her story that resonated with his own, this sense of being adrift, of trying to find solid ground after everything familiar had been torn away. They sat in silence for a while longer, listening to the fire pop and hiss, the distant sound of an owl hunting in the darkness. Finally, Teresa stood and stretched, her spine cracking audibly. "We should get some sleep," she said. "Early start tomorrow." Fletcher nodded and stood as well, moving to bank the fire for the night. They settled into their respective bunks, and within minutes, he could hear Teresa's breathing slow and deepen into sleep. He lay awake longer, staring at the rough log ceiling, thinking about the photograph in his saddlebag, about the way Teresa had said his brother's name with such gentleness, about the fact that, for the first time in 2 years, his silence had not felt quite so suffocating. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the grass outside the cabin. They checked the cattle thoroughly, finding everything in good order, then made the ride back down the mountain. By the time they reached the main ranch, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the mountains like fire. Patterson met them in the yard. "Any problems?" Teresa shook her head. "All good up there. Cattle are healthy, water is flowing fine, no sign of predators." "Good. We have got a situation developing. There has been reports of rustlers working the area, hitting ranches to the south. I want extra patrols set up, people riding the boundaries regular. Dawson, you and Graham will take the east section. Tom and Jack will cover west, Billy will stay close to home. Everyone goes armed, everyone stays alert. These are not amateurs. They hit the Morrison place last week, got away with 30 head before anyone knew they were there." Fletcher's jaw tightened. Rustlers meant confrontation, meant violence, meant the possibility of more bloodshed. His hand moved unconsciously to his side, where he wore his revolver these days more out of habit than expectation of needing it. "We will be careful," Teresa said, her voice steady despite the seriousness of the news. Over the next week, Fletcher and Teresa rode the eastern boundaries of the ranch every day, checking for signs of intrusion, making their presence known. The work was tedious but necessary. Hours in the saddle scanning the horizon, examining fence lines, counting cattle. They fell into an even deeper rhythm of silence, communicating with glances and gestures, working together with an efficiency that did not require words. On the 8th day, they found fresh tracks near one of the remote pastures, multiple horses moving at night, churning up the ground near a section of fence that had been cut and hastily repaired. Fletcher dismounted to examine the tracks more closely, his face grim. At least 4 riders, probably 5, moving a small herd. They had already been and gone, hitting the ranch while everyone slept. Teresa checked the surrounding area, then rode back to him. "How many head do you think they got?" Fletcher held up one hand, fingers spread, then another 3 fingers. 8, maybe more. We need to tell Patterson. Fletcher nodded and swung back into his saddle. They rode hard back to the ranch, pushing their horses faster than was wise, but knowing the information was time-sensitive. Patterson's face turned red with anger when they reported what they had found. "Damn it," he spat. "Right under our noses. All right, we need to organize. Dawson, Graham, you will track them. Take Billy with you. Tom and Jack will stay here and make sure they do not hit us again while we are spread thin. You find where they are operating from, you come back and report. Do not try to take them on yourselves, you hear me? I will not have anyone getting killed over cattle." Fletcher wanted to argue, wanted to say that he could handle himself, but the words would not come, and he knew Patterson was right anyway. 3 ranch hands against an organized gang of rustlers was bad odds. Better to locate them and come back with the sheriff and proper backup. They left within the hour, following the trail the rustlers had left. It led east toward the Utah Territory wilderness, through rough country where few honest people ventured. Billy was nervous, his hands tight on his reins, his eyes darting to every shadow. Teresa rode calm and alert, her rifle resting across her saddle, her jaw set with determination. Fletcher led the way, reading the signs left in the dirt and grass, following the path as surely as if the rustlers had painted arrows on the ground. They tracked for 2 days, camping cold at night without fires, eating jerky and hardtack, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. The trail led them through narrow canyons and over rocky ridges, always moving deeper into the backcountry. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, they crested a rise and looked down into a hidden valley where smoke rose from a small camp. Fletcher held up his hand, signaling the others to stop. They dismounted and moved forward on foot, keeping low, until they could see the camp clearly. 5 men sat around a fire, rough-looking characters with hard eyes and worn guns. Beyond them, a makeshift corral held cattle from at least 3 different brands, probably stolen from multiple ranches. "We found them," Teresa whispered. "Now what?" Fletcher gestured back the way they had come. They needed to get this information back to Patterson and the sheriff. But as they started to retreat, Billy's horse chose that moment to whinny loudly, the sound carrying clearly across the valley. Down below, the rustlers' heads snapped up. One of them pointed toward the ridge. "Someone up there! Run!" Teresa hissed, and they scrambled back to their horses, swinging into saddles and wheeling around. But the rustlers were already mounting up, and they knew this country better. What followed was a desperate chase through the canyons, the rustlers firing shots that echoed off the rock walls, Fletcher and Teresa and Billy pushing their horses to the limit, trying to stay ahead. A bullet whined past Fletcher's ear, too close. Another kicked up dirt near his horse's hooves. Billy was falling behind, his horse not as strong as the others, and Fletcher saw the moment when a lucky shot took the young man in the shoulder and he tumbled from his saddle. Teresa wheeled her horse around without hesitation, riding back toward Billy even as the rustlers closed in. Fletcher's heart seized in his chest. He could not lose someone else, could not watch another person die while he stood by helpless. He drew his revolver and turned his horse, charging back toward them, putting himself between Teresa and the oncoming rustlers. He fired twice, not aiming to kill but to scatter them to buy time. It worked. The rustlers pulled up short, taking cover behind rocks, suddenly cautious now that their prey was shooting back. Teresa reached Billy and hauled him up behind her saddle, the young man gasping in pain but conscious. Fletcher provided covering fire as they galloped away, then spurred his own horse after them. They rode hard for an hour, taking a twisting route through the canyons, finally losing the rustlers as darkness began to fall. When they finally stopped in a sheltered hollow, Billy was pale and shaking, blood soaking his shirt. Teresa eased him down from the horse and examined the wound by the last light of day. "It went through clean," she said, her hands steady as she packed the wound with cloth torn from her bandana. "You are going to be all right, Billy, but we need to get you back." "I am sorry," Billy gasped. "My horse, I did not mean to." "Hush," Teresa said firmly. "It was not your fault. These things happen. You just hold on, you hear me?" Fletcher watched her work, admiring the calm competence she displayed even in crisis. When she was done bandaging Billy as best she could, she looked up at Fletcher, her eyes meeting his in the gathering darkness. "We cannot outrun them if they pick up our trail again, not with Billy hurt," she said quietly. "We need to find a place to hole up for the night, somewhere defensible." Fletcher nodded and took the lead again, searching his memory of this country. There was a place he remembered from years ago, a small cave system about an hour's ride north. If they could reach it before full dark, they would have shelter and a position to defend if necessary. They made it to the caves just as the last light faded from the sky. Fletcher helped Teresa get Billy settled as comfortably as possible on a bed of pine boughs, then took up a position near the entrance, his rifle across his knees, staring out into the darkness. Teresa sat with Billy for a while, making sure his wound had not reopened, giving him water and quiet reassurance. When Billy finally dozed off, exhausted from pain and fear, Teresa moved to sit beside Fletcher. They did not dare light a fire, so they sat in darkness broken only by starlight, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness around them. "You saved us back there," Teresa said softly. "The way you rode back, put yourself between us and them, that took courage." Fletcher shook his head. He had not been thinking about courage. He had been thinking about Frank, about how he had failed his brother, about how he could not fail again. "You do not think so?" Teresa's voice held gentle challenge. "Fletcher, I saw your face when Billy fell. I saw what it cost you to turn around and ride back. That is courage, doing what needs doing even when you are terrified." She was quiet for a moment, then continued. "My mother used to say that silence is not the absence of words, it is the presence of something deeper. I did not understand what she meant until I met you. You communicate more with your silence than most people do with all their talking." Fletcher felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. In the darkness, emboldened by the fact that she could not see his face clearly, he reached out and touched her hand where it rested on her knee. Just a brief touch, his fingers brushing hers, but it said everything he could not speak aloud. "Thank you. I understand. You matter to me." Teresa caught his hand before he could pull it away, holding it gently. "We are going to be all right," she said. "All of us. We will get Billy home, we will deal with the rustlers, we will get through this, together." They sat like that for a long time, hands joined in the darkness, keeping watch over Billy and the night. Fletcher felt something he had not felt in 2 years, a small flicker of hope, a sense that maybe he was not as alone as he had believed. Billy's fever came with the dawn, his body fighting the shock and injury. Teresa stayed with him while Fletcher scouted their surroundings, checking for any sign of pursuit. He found nothing, but that did not mean the rustlers had given up. It meant they were being careful, biding their time. He returned to the cave to find Teresa sponging Billy's face with water, murmuring soft reassurances to the young man. Fletcher knelt beside them, examining Billy's wound. It looked clean, no sign of infection yet, but they needed to get him to a doctor soon. Teresa looked at Fletcher, and he saw the question in her eyes. He considered their options. They were still a full day's ride from the ranch, maybe more at the pace they could manage with Billy injured. The rustlers might be out there waiting for them to move, but staying here was not an option. Billy needed proper medical care. Fletcher made a decision. He pulled out his pencil and paper, writing quickly. "You take Billy back, I will draw them away." Teresa read the note and immediately shook her head. "Absolutely not. That is suicide." Fletcher wrote again, "Only chance. They want me. I shot at them. They will follow me. And what then?" Teresa's voice was fierce and low. "You lead them on a chase until they corner you and kill you. No, we stay together, we find another way." Fletcher met her eyes, putting every ounce of determination he possessed into his gaze. There was no other way, and she knew it. This was the only choice that gave all three of them a real chance to survive. Tears of frustration glittered in Teresa's eyes. "I cannot lose you," she whispered. "Not now. Not when I just found you." Fletcher reached up and touched her face, his rough palm against her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. Then he stood and began preparing his horse, checking his weapons, gathering what supplies he would need. Teresa watched him, her jaw tight, clearly fighting the urge to argue further. Finally, she stood and caught his arm, forcing him to look at her. "You come back to me," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you hear me, Fletcher Dawson? You lead them away, you lose them, and you come back. Because I am not done with you yet." Fletcher nodded, committing every detail of her face to memory. The way her eyes flashed with emotion, the determined set of her mouth, the strength in her grip on his arm. He wanted to tell her that she had brought light back into his dark world, that she had made him feel human again, that the thought of her was the only thing that would bring him back from whatever came next. But the words were still locked away, so he did the only thing he could think of. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle and brief, a promise without words. Then he swung into his saddle and rode out of the cave at a gallop, deliberately making noise, leaving a trail that even a blind man could follow. Behind him, he heard Teresa's voice calling his name, but he did not look back. If he looked back, he might not have the strength to leave. He rode east, away from the direction of the ranch, deeper into the wilderness. It did not take long for him to spot the dust of pursuit behind him. The rustlers had been watching after all, waiting for their chance. Good. That meant Teresa and Billy could make their way back safely while the danger followed him. The chase was hard and fast, through country that grew rougher with every mile. Fletcher knew he could not outrun them forever, not on a horse that was already tired from days of hard travel. He needed to find a place to make a stand, somewhere the odds might be less impossible. His mind raced through everything he knew about this area, trying to remember every canyon and rock formation from his years of ranging through these mountains. There was a place, maybe 3 hours ahead if he could stay ahead of the rustlers that long. A narrow defile between two cliffs where only one horse could pass at a time. If he could reach it, he could defend it. Maybe. The sun climbed higher as he rode, the heat building despite the altitude. His horse was flagging, foam showing on its neck, breathing hard. Behind him, the rustlers were gaining ground. Fletcher pushed on, asking everything his horse had to give, silently apologizing to the animal for demanding so much. He made it to the defile with maybe 10 minutes to spare. He rode through the narrow passage, then dismounted on the far side and slapped his horse's rump, sending it trotting away to safety. Then he positioned himself behind a boulder with a clear view of the passage, his rifle loaded and ready, his revolver loose in its holster. The rustlers appeared at the mouth of the defile, 5 of them just as he had counted before. They pulled up short when they saw the narrow passage, clearly recognizing the danger. One of them, a big man with a black beard and cold eyes, called out, "You are trapped in there, friend. No way out. Give yourself up and we will make it quick." Fletcher said nothing, simply aimed his rifle and waited. "Not the talkative type, huh?" the bearded man laughed. "Fine by me. Boys, we do this the hard way." They tried to rush the passage, 2 of them coming through at once on horseback. Fletcher dropped the first with a shot that took him in the chest, the man tumbling from his saddle. The second horse panicked at the gunfire in the confined space and reared, throwing its rider. Fletcher's second shot went wide, chipping rock near the fallen man's head. The rustler scrambled back through the passage to safety. A tense silence followed. Fletcher reloaded, counting his remaining ammunition, not enough for a prolonged siege. The rustlers knew it too. They would wait him out, knowing he had no water, no food, nowhere to go. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, turning the defile into an oven. Fletcher's throat was dry as dust, his lips cracked, sweat running down his back. He kept his rifle trained on the passage, not daring to relax his vigilance even as exhaustion pulled at him. As the sun began to set, he heard voices from the other side. They were planning something. He tensed, preparing for another rush. Instead, he heard hoofbeats retreating. They were leaving. It did not make sense, unless they were going around looking for another way to come at him from behind. Fletcher cursed silently. He had been so focused on defending the passage that he had not fully scouted the area behind him. If there was another way through these cliffs, he could be surrounded. He had to move. He slipped away from his position, moving as quietly as possible over the rocky ground, working his way along the cliff face, searching for a defensible position or a way out. The light was fading fast, which worked to his advantage, but also made the terrain treacherous. He heard them before he saw them, coming around the cliff from the north just as he had feared. 3 of them, the bearded man in the lead. They had not spotted him yet. Fletcher pressed himself into a narrow crack in the rock face, holding his breath. They passed within 10 feet of him, so close he could hear their conversation. "Find him and finish this," the bearded man was saying. "We have wasted too much time on this already. Once he is dealt with, we move the cattle tonight and clear out. This territory is getting too hot." "What about the other 2?" one of the others asked. "The woman and the kid, forget them. They are probably halfway back to their ranch by now. Let them tell their story. We will be long gone before any law shows up." They moved past, heading toward the defile where Fletcher had been. He waited until they were out of sight, then moved in the opposite direction, climbing higher into the rocks, looking for his horse, looking for any way to turn this situation around. He found his horse grazing in a small meadow as full darkness fell. The animal whickered softly at his approach, clearly relieved to see him. Fletcher checked the saddle, making sure everything was secure, then mounted up and began riding, not back toward the ranch but in a wide circle that would bring him around behind where the rustlers were searching. He rode through most of the night, stopping only to rest the horse briefly, pushing himself beyond exhaustion into a strange, floating state where nothing existed except the next mile, the next step. When dawn came, he was back in familiar territory, heading toward the ranch by a route the rustlers would not expect. He made it back by mid-morning, his horse stumbling with exhaustion, his own body so tired he could barely stay in the saddle. Teresa was in the yard when he rode in, helping load supplies onto a wagon. She turned at the sound of hoofbeats, and her face transformed. cycling through shock and relief and joy in quick succession. She ran to him as he dismounted, or rather fell from his saddle, his legs barely supporting his weight. She caught him, her arms around him, holding him up through sheer force of will. "You stubborn, reckless, impossible man," she said, and he felt her tears against his neck. "I thought you were dead. I thought you were gone." Patterson came out of the barn, Billy right behind him, the young man's arm in a sling but otherwise looking healthy. "Dawson, what happened?" Fletcher was too tired to write. He gestured vaguely in the direction he had come from, then pointed at Billy with a questioning look. "The doc fixed him up," Teresa said, still holding Fletcher like she was afraid he would disappear if she let go. "He is going to be fine." The sheriff went out with Tom and Jack and some men from town to hunt the rustlers. "They left 2 days ago." Fletcher nodded, relieved. At least the law was involved now. He had bought enough time with his wild chase. The rustlers would have moved on or been caught by now. His part in this was done. "Get him inside," Patterson ordered. "He looks like he is about to fall over. Teresa, make sure he eats something and gets some rest." Teresa guided Fletcher into the bunkhouse and sat him down on his bed. She brought him water first, making him drink slowly, then bread and cold beef which he ate mechanically. When he was done, she took off his boots and pushed him gently back onto the bed. "Sleep," she said. "I will be right here." Fletcher wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she had work to do, but his body had other ideas. The moment his head hit the pillow, he was gone, falling into sleep so deep it was like death. He woke to lamplight and the sound of voices. Evening had come again, a whole day lost to sleep. He sat up slowly, his body stiff and sore, his mouth tasting like old leather. Teresa was sitting at the small table near the window, mending a shirt. She looked up when he stirred. "Welcome back," she said softly. "How do you feel?" Fletcher considered the question, taking inventory. "Exhausted still, but alive. Whole." He nodded to indicate he was all right. "The sheriff came back while you were sleeping," Teresa said, setting aside her mending. "They caught the rustlers, all 5 of them, caught them trying to move the stolen cattle through a canyon pass. There was a gunfight. 2 of the rustlers were killed, 3 surrendered. The cattle are being returned to their rightful owners. It is over." Fletcher felt tension he had been carrying for days finally ease from his shoulders. It was over. Billy was safe, Teresa was safe, the rustlers were dealt with. The ending was as good as they could have hoped for. Teresa stood and came to sit beside him on the bed. "The sheriff wanted to talk to you, wanted your statement about what happened. But I told him you needed rest, that it could wait. He understands. He said to tell you that what you did, leading them away from Billy and me, that took real courage. He called you a hero." Fletcher shook his head immediately. He was not a hero. He had just done what needed doing. "You can deny it all you want," Teresa said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But that does not make it less true. You saved our lives, Fletcher. You saved Billy's life. You saved mine. That means something." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "While you were sleeping, I had time to think. About what I want, what matters to me, what I am willing to fight for. I realized something. I came here looking for work, looking for a way to rebuild the life I lost. But what I found was something different. I found you." Fletcher's heart was beating hard against his ribs. He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face, seeing the emotion there, the vulnerability. "I know you cannot speak," Teresa continued, her voice soft but steady. "I know you have wounds that have not healed, grief you are still carrying. But I want you to know that I am here. I am not going anywhere. And whatever comes next, whatever you need, I am with you, if you will have me." Fletcher felt something breaking open inside him, some dam that had held back 2 years of grief and loneliness and pain. He wanted to tell her yes, wanted to tell her that she had become the best part of his days, that thinking of her had kept him alive in that canyon, that he was falling in love with her more with every passing hour. But the words would not come, locked behind whatever wall his trauma had built. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, then pressed her palm against his chest where she could feel his heart racing. He looked into her eyes, trying to pour everything he felt into that gaze, hoping she could read in his face what he could not say aloud. "I understand," Teresa whispered. "I understand, Fletcher." She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet, and he kissed her back with 2 years of silence behind it, with everything he had been holding inside, with hope he had thought he would never feel again. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, both of them had tears on their faces. "We will figure this out," Teresa said, resting her forehead against his. "Whatever we need to do, whatever it takes, we will figure it out together." Fletcher nodded, holding her close, feeling for the first time since Frank died that he might actually be able to heal, that he might actually have a future worth living. The next week brought changes. Patterson, impressed by how Teresa had handled the crisis and grateful for Fletcher's role in stopping the rustlers, offered them both permanent positions with increased wages and more responsibility. Tom and Jack treated both of them with new respect, and Billy followed Fletcher around like a puppy, clearly hero-worshipping the man who had saved his life. Fletcher and Teresa settled into a new rhythm, their relationship shifting and deepening. They took their meals together, worked side by side during the days, spent their evenings talking by the fire or walking along the creek that ran through the property. Teresa talked enough for both of them, telling stories about her childhood, her parents, her dreams for the future. Fletcher listened and nodded and occasionally wrote notes when he had something specific to communicate. One evening about a month after the rustler incident, they were sitting by a fire outside the bunkhouse, the summer stars bright overhead. Most of the other hands had gone into town for the weekend, leaving the ranch quiet. Teresa was talking about a letter she had received from her father, how he was doing well in California, how he had found work on an orchard and was thinking of buying some land. "He wants me to come visit," she said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Says California is beautiful, that I would love it there, but I cannot imagine leaving here, cannot imagine leaving you." She looked over at Fletcher, her expression serious. "He asked in the letter if I had met anyone, if there was a reason I was so determined to stay in Utah. I did not know what to write back. How do I explain you to him? How do I explain us?" Fletcher pulled out his paper and pencil. He had been thinking about this, thinking about what he wanted, what kind of future he could offer her. He wrote carefully, then handed her the note. "I love you, want to marry you, if you will have me." Teresa stared at the words, her eyes going wide. "Fletcher." He took the paper back and wrote more. "I know I cannot give you words, but I can give you everything else. My heart, my life, my loyalty, if that is enough." "Enough," Teresa laughed, the sound breaking into something like a sob. "Fletcher, it is more than enough, it is everything. Yes." "Of course, yes." She threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him over, laughing and crying at the same time. Fletcher held her tight, his face buried in her hair, feeling a joy so intense it was almost painful. He had never expected to feel this way again, had never expected to find someone who could see past his silence to the person underneath. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony in Alta, with Patterson and the ranch hands as witnesses. Teresa wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and Fletcher wore his best shirt and pants, his boots polished until they shone. The preacher kept the ceremony short, not requiring Fletcher to speak his vows aloud, accepting his written responses as sufficient. When the preacher said he could kiss his bride, Fletcher cupped Teresa's face in his hands and kissed her with all the love he could not speak. And she kissed him back with equal passion, and everyone cheered. Patterson gave them 3 days off for a honeymoon, which they spent at a small cabin up in the mountains, the same lined shack where they had weathered the night during the rustler hunt. They brought supplies and blankets, and spent the days exploring the high meadows and the nights wrapped in each other's arms, learning each other's bodies with tenderness and passion, building a marriage on touch and trust rather than words. On their last night before returning to the ranch, they sat by the fire as the sun set, Teresa nestled against Fletcher's side. She had been quiet for a while, which was unusual for her, and he looked down at her questioningly. "I was just thinking," she said, "about how strange life is. A year ago, I was in Denver, sewing shirts and hating every minute, convinced I would never find my way back to the life I wanted. And now I am here, married to you, living the life I always dreamed of. It is strange how quickly everything can change." Fletcher understood exactly what she meant. A year ago, he had been convinced he would live the rest of his life alone, locked in silence, never connecting with another person again. And now he had Teresa, had a marriage, had hope. Life was strange indeed. "Do you ever think about speaking again?" Teresa asked quietly. "Do you ever want to try?" Fletcher considered the question. He pulled out his paper and wrote, "Sometimes. Not sure I remember how, scared to try and fail." Teresa read the note and nodded slowly. "I understand. There is no pressure, you know. I fell in love with you exactly as you are. Whether you speak or not does not change what I feel. But if you ever do want to try, I will be there, supporting you, believing in you." Fletcher kissed the top of her head in response, grateful for her understanding, for the way she accepted him without trying to change him. They returned to the ranch the next day to find that Patterson had given them the small cabin behind the main house as their own, the same one Teresa had stayed in when she first arrived. It was still small, but it was theirs, a place to build their life together. They spent the next weeks fixing it up, adding shelves and a bigger bed, hanging curtains, making it into a home. The seasons turned. Summer faded into autumn, the aspens on the mountains turning gold and orange. The work on the ranch shifted to preparing for winter, moving cattle down from the high pastures, repairing buildings, stocking supplies. Fletcher and Teresa worked together through all of it, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. In late October, Teresa came to Fletcher one evening with a strange look on her face. He set down the tack he was mending and looked at her questioningly. "I need to tell you something," she said, sitting down beside him. "I am with child. We are going to have a baby." Fletcher felt his heart stop and then start again, beating double time. A baby. He was going to be a father. The joy was immediate and overwhelming, followed quickly by terror. How could he be a father when he could not speak? How could he teach a child, guide a child, communicate with a child? Teresa seemed to read the fear in his face. "I know," she said gently. "I know it is scary, but we will figure it out just like we figure everything else out, together." Fletcher nodded slowly, then pulled her into his arms, holding her close. A baby. New life coming into the world. Frank would have been so happy, would have been the best uncle any child could want. The thought brought sadness, but also a strange kind of comfort. Maybe this child would carry something of Frank forward, a continuation of the family line that Fletcher had thought was ended. Over the next months, as Teresa's belly grew and winter set in, Fletcher found himself thinking more and more about speaking. Not for himself, but for the child. He wanted to be able to say his child's name, wanted to be able to comfort them with words, wanted to be able to tell them stories and sing them songs and do all the things fathers were supposed to do. One evening in late December, with snow falling softly outside their cabin and Teresa dozing in the chair by the fire, Fletcher sat at the table with paper and pencil. He had been writing more lately, journaling his thoughts and memories, trying to work through the trauma that had stolen his voice. He wrote about Frank, about the ambush that had killed him, about the guilt and grief that had consumed him after. It had been a routine job, escorting a payroll shipment through disputed territory. Fletcher and Frank had taken it because the money was good and they were young and confident in their skills. But they had been ambushed, outnumbered 5-2, and in the chaos, Frank had been shot. Fletcher had killed 3 of the ambushers and driven off the other 2, but it had not mattered. Frank was dying, and there was nothing Fletcher could do but hold him as his life bled out onto the desert sand. The last thing Frank had said was, "Do not blame yourself, brother. This is not your fault." And then he was gone, and Fletcher had opened his mouth to scream his grief and rage, and no sound had come out. His voice had disappeared with Frank's last breath, locked away behind a wall of trauma and guilt so thick that 2 years of trying had not broken through it. Fletcher set down his pencil and looked at his sleeping wife, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. He thought about the child growing inside her, the new life that would arrive in a few months. He thought about Frank, about what his brother would say if he could see Fletcher now. And he realized that Frank would want him to try, would want him to heal, would want him to be the best father he could be. Slowly, carefully, Fletcher shaped his mouth around a word. It had been so long since he tried to make sound that he was not sure he remembered how. He took a breath and pushed air through his vocal cords, trying to make them vibrate, trying to form sound. Nothing came out but a dry rasp. He tried again, pushing harder, and managed a strangled noise that sounded nothing like a word. It startled Teresa awake, her eyes flying open, searching for the source of the sound. "Fletcher," she said, sitting up straighter, were you trying to speak?" He nodded, frustrated, pointing to his throat. "Try again," she said, moving to sit beside him. "Take your time." "There is no rush." Fletcher tried again, focusing on the simplest word he could think of, T. The consonant came out rough and strange, almost unrecognizable. Ter. His voice cracked, unused to making these sounds. Teresa grabbed his hand, squeezing tight. "You are doing it," she whispered. "Keep going, Teresa." The word finally came out whole, rough and hoarse, but undeniably a word, her name. The first word he had spoken in 2 years. Teresa's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, that is me. You said my name, Fletcher, you said my name." He tried more words, his voice slowly remembering how to work. "Love you." The words were halting and rough, but they were words. Love, baby. Teresa was crying openly now, laughing and crying at the same time. "We love you too," she said. "So much, I cannot believe it." Your voice came back. Fletcher touched his throat, marveling at the sensation of sound vibrating there. It felt strange, felt foreign, but also felt right. He tried more words, simple things at first, rediscovering his voice one syllable at a time. Snow, fire, home. They stayed up half the night, Fletcher practicing speaking while Teresa encouraged him, neither of them able to sleep from the excitement. By the time they finally went to bed, Fletcher's throat was sore and his voice was barely a whisper, but he could speak. After 2 years of silence, he had found his voice again. In the morning, when they went to the main house for breakfast, Fletcher quietly told Patterson what had happened. The old man's weathered face broke into a smile. "Well, I will be damned," Patterson said. "That is good news, Dawson." "Real good news. Must be that baby on the way giving you reason to speak up." "Maybe," Fletcher said, his voice still rough but growing stronger. "Or maybe it was time." The next months brought more changes. Fletcher practiced speaking every day, his voice slowly returning to normal. The though it always carried a slight roughness that it had not had before. The baby grew, and Teresa bloomed with pregnancy, glowing with health and happiness. In early April, on a warm spring day with wildflowers blooming across the meadows, Teresa went into labor. Fletcher rode into town for the doctor and the midwife, then paced outside the cabin while they worked, terrified and excited in equal measure. The labor was long, lasting through the night and into the next day, but when it was finally over, the midwife brought out a squalling, red-faced baby boy. "Healthy lungs on this one," she said with a smile, handing the baby to Fletcher. "Congratulations, Mr. Dawson." Fletcher looked down at his son, at the tiny face and the small fists waving in the air, and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. This was his child, his son, a new life that carried both him and Frank forward into the future. "What are we naming him?" Teresa asked from inside the cabin, her voice tired but happy. Fletcher had been thinking about this for months. He carried the baby inside and sat on the edge of the bed, showing Teresa their son. "Frank," he said quietly. "I want to name him Frank, after my brother." Teresa's eyes softened with understanding. "Frank Dawson," she said, touching the baby's tiny hand. "That is a good name, a strong name." They settled into the chaos of new parenthood over the next weeks and months. Baby Frank was demanding and loud and perfect, keeping them awake at all hours, requiring constant attention and care. Fletcher marveled at how such a small person could completely transform their lives, could bring such joy and exhaustion in equal measure. One evening in late summer, when little Frank was about 4 months old, Fletcher sat outside the cabin with his son in his arms, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold. Teresa came out and sat beside them, leaning her head on Fletcher's shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Fletcher looked down at his son, then over at his wife, then out at the mountains that had become his home. He thought about how far he had come, from the broken man who had arrived at this ranch 3 years ago, unable to speak and barely able to function, to this moment, holding his son and sitting beside the woman he loved. "Yes," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I am happy. More than I ever thought I could be again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out one by one. Little Frank dozed in Fletcher's arms, making small baby noises. It was a perfect moment, peaceful and complete. "Do you remember the night I whispered your name by the fire?" Fletcher said suddenly. "When I spoke for the first time in 2 years, of course I remember," Teresa said. "How could I forget? It was like a miracle." "It felt like one," Fletcher agreed. "Like everything that had been broken inside me suddenly had a chance to heal. You did that, Teresa. You and this little one. You gave me a reason to find my voice again." Teresa kissed his cheek. "We just reminded you that it was there all along. You did the hard work of actually finding it." The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered, and Fletcher and Teresa prospered with it. When Patterson retired 5 years later, he sold the ranch to Fletcher and Teresa, recognizing that they had been running it in all but name for years anyway. They renamed it the Double D Ranch for Dawson, and set about building it into something even better. They had 3 more children over the next 8 years. A daughter they named Mary, after Teresa's mother, then twin boys they named James and Thomas. The cabin behind the main house became too small, so they built a proper house on a rise overlooking the valley, with enough room for their growing family and a wide porch where they could sit and watch the sunsets. Fletcher never forgot Frank, but the pain of his loss softened over time, transforming from a sharp wound into a gentle ache, a reminder of love rather than loss. He told his children about their uncle, about the adventures they had shared, about the man Frank had been. Young Frank especially loved these stories, proud to carry his uncle's name. The ranch grew, and with it, their reputation. Fletcher became known as a fair man to work for, demanding but just, and Teresa as a woman who could run a ranch as well as any man. They faced challenges over the years, droughts and hard winters and market fluctuations, but they faced them together, their partnership only growing stronger with time. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Fletcher took Teresa back up to the line shack where they had spent their honeymoon. It was early summer, the meadows thick with wildflowers, the streams running high with snowmelt. They left the children in the care of their foreman, who had worked for them for 10 years and was trusted completely. They rode up the familiar trail, older now but still strong, still comfortable in the saddle. When they reached the cabin, it looked exactly the same as it had all those years ago, a testament to how little some things changed in this high country. They unpacked their supplies and built a fire as the sun set, sitting close together, just as they had done so many times before. Fletcher looked at his wife in the firelight, seeing the lines that time had added to her face, the silver streaking through her brown hair, and thought she had never been more beautiful. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Choosing this life, choosing me?" Teresa laughed and shook her head. "Not for one single moment. This is exactly the life I wanted, Fletcher. You are exactly who I wanted. I would not change a thing." "Even the silent years?" he asked with a slight smile. "Especially the silent years," Teresa said firmly. "Those years taught us to communicate without words, to trust each other completely. That foundation made everything else possible." Fletcher reached out and took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I love you," he said. "I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Teresa replied. "Always have, always will." They sat by the fire long into the night, talking about their children, about the ranch, about their dreams for the future. They talked about expanding the cattle operation, about buying the adjacent property that had recently come up for sale, about maybe taking a trip to California to visit Teresa's father, who was getting old and would love to see his grandchildren. But mostly they just enjoyed being together, away from the demands of the ranch and children, reconnected to the people they had been when this all started, when a mute cowboy and a woman looking for work had found each other and built something beautiful out of shared silence and growing trust. As the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, Fletcher thought about how lucky he was, how close he had come to missing all of this. If he had not found the courage to turn back and save Billy and Teresa from the rustlers. If he had not survived that chase through the canyons. If Teresa had not been patient with his silence, had not seen past it to the man underneath. If he had not found the courage to try speaking again. So many moments where everything could have gone differently, could have ended in tragedy instead of this joy. But it had not. Somehow, against all odds, it had worked out. He had found love again, had found peace, had built a family and a life worth living. Frank would have been happy for him, would have approved of Teresa, would have loved being an uncle to the children. And in a way, Frank was there, living on in the son who carried his name, in the stories Fletcher told, in the memories that Fletcher carried with him always. The next morning they woke early and rode higher into the mountains, to places they had not visited in years. They found a clear alpine lake and stopped to rest, letting the horses graze while they sat by the water's edge. The silence was profound, broken only by birdsong and the whisper of wind through the pines. "This is where I feel closest to God," Teresa said quietly. "Up here, away from everything else. It is like the whole world is laid out at your feet and you can see the pattern of it all." Fletcher nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. There was something about these mountains that put everything in perspective, that reminded you how small you were in the grand scheme of things, but also how precious, how meaningful even a single life could be. They rode back down to the cabin in the afternoon, packed up their supplies, and began the journey home. As they rode, Fletcher found himself thinking about the future, about what came next. The children were growing fast. Young Frank was 15 now, already talking about taking on more responsibility around the ranch. Mary was 12, sharp as a tack and showing signs of having her mother's business sense. The twins were 7, wild and full of energy, always getting into some kind of mischief. In a few years, Frank would be a man, ready to start making his own decisions about his life. Would he stay on the ranch or strike out on his own? Would the other children follow, or would they scatter to the winds? Fletcher did not know, but he hoped they would stay, hoped they would want to continue what he and Teresa had built. But even if they did not, even if they all left to make their own ways in the world, Fletcher knew he would be proud of them. He and Teresa had raised them right, had given them the tools they needed to survive and thrive, had shown them what real love looked like. That was all any parent could do. When they reached the ranch, the children came running out to meet them, full of stories about what had happened while they were gone. The twins had found a litter of kittens in the barn. Mary had helped balance the accounts and found an error that had been costing them money for months. Frank had broken a new horse all by himself, a difficult animal that no one else had been able to handle. Fletcher and Teresa listened to it all, smiling at their children's excitement, proud of what they had accomplished. This was what it was all about, Fletcher thought. Not the land or the cattle or the money. The family, the love, the connections that bound them all together. That night, after the children were in bed, Fletcher and Teresa sat on the porch of their house, watching the stars. Fletcher had his arm around Teresa's shoulders, and she leaned into him, comfortable and content. "Thank you," Fletcher said quietly. "For what?" Teresa asked. "For seeing me," Fletcher said. "For loving me when I could not speak, for being patient while I found my way back. For giving me this family, this life, for everything." Teresa tilted her head up to look at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "You do not have to thank me for any of that. I got just as much out of this as you did, maybe more. You gave me a home, Fletcher. You gave me a purpose. You gave me love when I had given up on ever finding it, so maybe we should just call it even." Fletcher smiled and kissed her forehead. "Even," he agreed. They sat in silence for a while longer, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other so well that words were often unnecessary. Fletcher thought back to the man he had been when he first arrived at this ranch, broken and silent and barely holding on. That man would never have believed he could be this happy, could find this much peace. But here he was, living proof that healing was possible, that love could bridge any gap, that even the deepest wounds could eventually scar over and become part of your history rather than your whole identity. The fire by which he had first whispered Teresa's name all those years ago had been a turning point, the moment when he began to believe he might have a future after all. But it had not been the end of the story. It had been the beginning. Everything that came after, all the joy and love and life, had flowed from that one moment of courage, that decision to try, to open himself up to the possibility of connection again. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, Fletcher and Teresa finally went inside, checking on the children one last time before retiring to their own room. Fletcher looked at his wife in the lamplight as she brushed out her hair, the same ritual she had performed every night for 20 years, and felt a surge of love so strong it almost hurt. "I would do it all again," he said suddenly. "Every bit of it. The silence, the pain, all of it. If it meant ending up here with you." Teresa set down her brush and came to him, taking his face in her hands. "Me too," she said. "Every single moment." They kissed, slow and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and shared history. Then they climbed into bed, wrapped in each other's arms, and fell asleep to the sound of wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes, more challenges, more joys. Young Frank did stay on the ranch, taking over more and more responsibility as Fletcher slowly stepped back. At 21, Frank married a girl from town, a sweet-natured young woman named Alice who fit into the family like she had always been there. They built a house on the other side of the property and started their own family, giving Fletcher and Teresa their first grandchildren. Mary went to college back east, something nearly unheard of for a girl from a Utah ranch. But she was brilliant and determined, and Fletcher and Teresa were not about to hold her back. She studied business and economics, then came home and used what she had learned to help the ranch navigate the changing economic landscape of the early 1900s. She never married, claiming she was too busy for romance, but she seemed happy and fulfilled, and that was all that mattered. The twins both left for a while, needing to see the world and test themselves against it. James became a lawman, working as a deputy in various towns across the West, sending letters home full of adventures. Thomas tried his hand at mining, then ranching, then finally settled on being a horse trader, traveling the territory buying and selling quality stock. But they both came home regularly, and Fletcher knew they would eventually settle nearby. The land called to them, just like it had called to him. Fletcher himself aged gracefully, his hair going white, his body growing slower but no less capable. He still rode every day, still helped with the work when he could, still knew every inch of the ranch like the back of his hand. Teresa aged beside him, her hair silver, her face lined, but her eyes still bright, her spirit still strong. On a warm summer evening when Fletcher was 68 years old, he and Teresa once again sat on their porch watching the sunset. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, 4 of them now with more on the way. Young Frank and Alice lived just across the way, close enough to help but far enough to have their own space. Mary was inside working on the account books, even though Fletcher kept telling her she worked too hard. The twins were both visiting, James between jobs and Thomas between buying trips. Fletcher looked out at the land he and Teresa had built into something meaningful, at the family they had created, at the life they had lived together. It was more than he had ever dreamed possible in those dark days after Frank died, more than he had imagined when he first rode into this valley broken and silent. "What are you thinking about?" Teresa asked, taking his hand. "How it all turned out," Fletcher said. "How one moment, one evening by the fire changed everything." Teresa squeezed his hand. "The evening you whispered my name." "Yes," Fletcher said. "That was when I knew. When I knew I could come back from the darkness, when I knew you were worth fighting for, when I knew I wanted to live again." It all started there. "And look at us now," Teresa said with a smile. 35 years married, 4 children, 4 grandchildren and counting, the best ranch in the territory. Not bad for a mute cowboy and a desperate woman looking for work. Fletcher laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Not bad at all." They sat together as the sun dipped below the mountains, and the stars began to emerge, surrounded by family and love and the legacy they had built together. Fletcher thought about Frank, about the brother he had lost, and knew that Frank would be proud of what Fletcher had made of his life. He had honored Frank's memory not by drowning in grief, but by living fully, by loving completely, by building something that would outlast them both. As the evening deepened and the children were called inside for bed, Fletcher and Teresa remained on the porch, unwilling to let go of the perfect peace of the moment. They had been through so much together, survived so many challenges, overcome so many obstacles. And through it all, they had held onto each other, their love the anchor that kept them steady no matter how rough the waters. "You remember what you said to me that first night at the line shack?" Teresa asked. "When you showed me the picture of you and Frank?" Fletcher thought back to that night so long ago. "I did not say anything. I could not speak yet." "No, but you communicated," Teresa said. "With your eyes, with the way you held that photograph like it was the most precious thing in the world. You told me that you had lost everything, that you were barely holding on, that you did not know if you could survive the pain. But you also told me that you were willing to try, that there was still a spark of hope left somewhere deep inside. That is what I fell in love with, Fletcher. Not your words, not your voice, but that spark, that refusal to completely give up even when everything seemed hopeless." Fletcher felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You fanned that spark into a flame," he said quietly. "You and our family. You gave me reason to keep going, reason to heal, reason to live. I would have died without you, Teresa. Maybe not physically, but in every way that mattered." "We saved each other," Teresa said firmly. "I was just as lost as you were when I came here. I had lost my home, my family, my sense of purpose. I was going through the motions of living but not really alive. And then I found you, found this place, found a reason to care again. So do not put it all on me. We did this together." Fletcher pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Together," he agreed. "Always together." As the last light faded from the sky and the mountain air grew cool, they finally went inside to their warm house full of family and love. Fletcher looked around at the life they had built, at the people they had created and nurtured, at the home they had made, and knew that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not without pain or challenge, but real and solid and good. That night, lying in bed with Teresa asleep beside him, Fletcher thought about legacy, about what they would leave behind when their time came. The ranch would go on, passing to Frank and eventually his children. The family would continue branching and growing. But more than that, they were leaving behind an example of what real love looked like, of what commitment and partnership and perseverance could accomplish. They were leaving behind the story of a mute cowboy who had lost everything but found the courage to try again, and a determined woman who had refused to let circumstances define her. They were leaving behind proof that healing was possible, that second chances were real, that even the deepest wounds could be transformed into sources of strength rather than weakness. Fletcher closed his eyes, listening to Teresa breathe, feeling the warmth of her beside him, and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For this woman, for this family, for this life. For the evening by the fire when he had whispered her name and started down the path that led to this moment. For every joy and every sorrow that had shaped him into the man he was. The years continued their steady march. Fletcher and Teresa celebrated their 40th anniversary, then their 45th. More grandchildren arrived and then great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to prosper under Frank's capable management, with Mary's business acumen guiding its financial decisions. The twins both eventually settled nearby, James as the sheriff of Alta and Thomas, with his own horse ranch just over the next ridge. Through it all, Fletcher and Teresa remained the center of it all, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They slowed down as age demanded, giving up the daily work of the ranch but remaining involved in the major decisions. They spent their days on the porch, watching their legacy unfold before them, surrounded by family and love. On a warm spring morning in 1925, when Fletcher was 76 years old and had been married to Teresa for 47 years, he woke to find her still asleep beside him. The sun was streaming through the window, painting everything in shades of gold. He watched her sleep, this woman who had transformed his life, and felt the same rush of love he had felt all those years ago. She stirred and opened her eyes, smiling when she saw him watching her. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," Fletcher replied. "I love you." "I love you too," Teresa said, reaching out to touch his face. "What do you say we go sit on the porch and watch the sunrise, just like old times?" They got dressed slowly, their bodies stiff with age but their spirits still willing. They made their way to the porch and settled into their chairs, watching as the sun climbed higher and the ranch came to life around them. Frank was already up and working. They could see him in the distance moving cattle. Mary emerged from the main house with her morning coffee, waving to them as she headed to the office. The great-grandchildren would be up soon, filling the house with noise and laughter. "It is a good life," Teresa said softly. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "The best," Fletcher agreed, taking her hand. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the world wake up, feeling the warmth of the sun and each other's presence. Fletcher thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that first day when Teresa had arrived looking for work, to the evening by the fire when he had whispered her name, to this moment surrounded by everything they had built together. It had not always been easy. There had been hardships and losses, challenges and setbacks. But they had faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year, their commitment to each other never wavering. They had built something that would outlast them, a legacy of love and family and hard work that would continue for generations. As the morning progressed, and the family began to gather for breakfast, Fletcher looked at Teresa and smiled. She smiled back, and in that smile, he saw everything they had been and everything they were. Two people who had found each other when they were both lost, who had built a life together through silence and words, who had loved each other through good times and bad, who had created something beautiful out of shared determination and unwavering commitment. The mute cowboy had found his voice again, whispered the name of the woman he loved by the fire, and discovered that love was the most powerful force in the world, capable of healing any wound and bridging any distance. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. As they walked inside together to join their family for breakfast, Fletcher squeezed Teresa's hand, and she squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was everything they needed to say. After 47 years of marriage, some things required no words at all. They had come full circle, from silence to words and back to a deeper silence, the kind that only came from truly knowing another person completely. And as they sat down at the table surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them talking and laughing and living the lives that Fletcher and Teresa had made possible, Fletcher said one more silent prayer of gratitude. For the evening by the fire. For the courage to whisper her name, for every moment that had followed. For this life, this love, this family, for everything.